Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The webinar will begin shortly and will discuss renewable energy disruption in the Australian electricity industry. We have over 320 people registered for this webinar today from all around in the world. In particular, I would like to welcome all the participants in the time zone of AEST. Thanks for joining. My name is Joanna Costello. I'm the Deputy Executive Secretary at the International Solar Energy Society, ISES. Our headquarters are in Freiburg, Germany. That is where I'm joining you this morning. I will take you through a very short introduction and then hand over to our webinar moderators, Monica Oliphant and Ben Elliston. Today's webinar will focus on renewable energy disruption in the Australian electricity industry. Before we begin with the webinar presentations, I would like to inform you about what ISES is and stands for. The International Solar Energy Society, ISES, is a non-profit UN-accredited membership NGO. The ISES vision is to achieve 100% renewable energy for all used efficiently and wisely. We represent a diverse membership of academics, researchers, energy practitioners, consultants, students, businesses and advocates. ISES works together with like-minded organizations from countries around the world to advance the renewable energy transformation. By becoming a member of ISES, you are supporting the 100% renewable energy movement. Please have a look at our websites, www.ises.org, and our membership page, join.ises.org. The presentations and recording of this webinar will be available on the ISES website for ISES members. Please log into our newly launched, redesigned, mobile-friendly ISES website at ises.org to view the presentations and the recording of this webinar. If you are not a member, please have a look at our website and our membership page, and I do encourage you to have a browse through our benefits and services and to join up. The recording of this webinar will also be available on our ISES YouTube channel. I'll be sending you all a link in the follow-up email. You are welcome and encouraged to ask questions at any time throughout the webinar. To ask a question, select the questions pane on your screen and type in your question. Please specify who your question is directed to. Questions will be addressed after all the presentations in a moderated Q&A session. We would also like to encourage you to use the ISES discussion forum on LinkedIn to continue the Q&A and the discussion even after the webinar has ended. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Monica Oliphant, past president of the International Solar Energy Society, and Ben Elliston from IT Power Australia.
Good, thank you. So welcome to this ISES webinar set for the Asia Pacific time zones. And I'd very much like to hear later whether this is a suitable time to hold webinars in our region in future. I'm looking forward to the presentations. South Australia, where I come from, we have recently exceeded our 2025 target of 50% renewables in our electricity generating mix. Predominantly, this is from wind and solar. This transition to high penetration variable renewables has mainly happened in the last 10 years and has brought about disruption to the status quo in the electricity supply industry. And I can't believe the aggressive and blatant misinformation in the media, politically, and from the fossil fuel industry that has happened as a result. Changing direction in a well-established industry was never going to be easy. And though probably not realistic, it would be really great if there could be widespread cooperation to enable South Australia achieve a well-planned, reliable and cost-effective renewable energy supply to be proud of at home and globally. At this stage, however, South Australia has led to the trigger and realisation that a transition to a new energy system has begun, and we have three high-profile, well-respected experts who in the short time allocated will give us an overview of what is happening in Australia's electricity supply industry and dispel some myths. Ben Elliston will now say a few words and introduce our speakers. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Monica. I'm just going to be introducing the speakers, and then I'll be also running the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Our first speaker is Dr. Hugh Sadler. Hugh Sadler is an independent consultant who has spent almost all of his professional life working on issues related to energy and environmental policy. This has been as an academic, government employee and consultant. He is the author of a book on Australian energy policy and over 70 scientific papers, monographs and articles. He is a regular media commentator on energy and climate change policy and the author of a monthly newsletter that tracks and reports on trends in Australian energy supply, consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Then we'll be followed on with Tristan Edis. Tristan is the Director of Analysis and Advisory at Green Energy Markets, where he assists clients understand and make informed decisions surrounding renewable energy, energy efficiency and other carbon abatement markets. Tristan's involvement in the clean energy sector and related government climate change and energy policy and market issues dates back more than a decade. Tristan's prior experience includes time as the editor of Australia's leading daily news and analysis publication on clean energy issues, Climate Spectator, research fellow at the Grattan Institute think tank, the Clean Energy Council, Ernst & Young and the Australian Government's Greenhouse Office. And the final speaker today will be Andrew Stock. Andrew is a councillor in the Climate Council and has over 40 years of experience in senior management and executive roles in energy businesses spanning traditional energy suppliers and emerging energy technologies and renewables, including being a foundation member of Origin Energy's executive leadership team from 2000 to 2012. He is a board member of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and founding national president of the Australian Business Council for Sustainable Energy, now the Clean Energy Council, and has served on CSIRO's Energy and Transport Sector Advisory Committee as well as other research and energy advisory committees to the South Australian Government. So each speaker will have 15 minutes, and when there's about 2 minutes to go, I'll let those speakers know that they're running low on time. So without any more delay, we'll put Hugh Sadler's slides up and we'll get started. Okay, Hugh, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everybody. What I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of a background about where the Australian electricity industry today and the problems that it's facing, not only ones, in fact, probably most of them not attributable to the growing share of renewable in the system, but a whole lot of other problems that are all coinciding, which hopefully places us on the cusp of a really big transition. So first of all, just a bit of historical background. For those of you who don't know the Australian electricity industry so well, the biggest part of Australia is all for part of what's called the national electricity market, and that's all of the effectively, well, mostly the eastern half of Australia, where about 90% of the electricity consumption and 90% of happens and 90% of the population lives. This was set up in the mid-1990s, and I've put up on this slide what it's called the National Electricity Objective. These are the goals for which it's supposedly being managed. Two things are really important about this. First of all, there is absolutely no mention of in any sort of environmental considerations, let alone climate change. And secondly, the emphasis on price, quality, safety, reliability and security, and mostly what I'm going to be showing over the next 10 minutes is how in fact it's failing in respect of most of those objectives, and this is what's putting a lot of pressure on the system, and the arguments and the media rubbish and so on that Monica spoke about is a lot of people trying to say that all these failures are attributable to a renewable supply, whereas almost all of them are not attributable to that. First of all, just to by way of a bit of a background about the national electricity market, it's a very long, sort of thin or stringy interconnected grid. I forget how many thousand kilometres from the northeast. It's 5,000 kilometres from the far northeast, far north of Queensland to the west of South Australia and across Bass Strait through a DC cable to Tasmania. And it's structured into 5 regions which correspond to the former 5 state governments which were separate government-owned electricity supply monopoly businesses. And they form 5 separate regions in the market. The market is a gross pool energy-only market for generation, and there is some interconnection, but it's sometimes between the regions, but it sometimes gets congested. The total electrical energy consumption last year, over the year, 186 terawatt hours. That doesn't include the rooftop solar and also some embedded generation. The maximum coincident peak was 32 gigawatts, and of course the regions aren't coincident, so if you added up all the individuals, it's about 36. So because of its geographical diversity, there is some benefit in diversity. There'd be more benefit, well, for solar, not so much for wind maybe, if it was more east-west rather than north-south. And finally, I'll just put down the supply mix there, which you can see it's very heavily dominated by coal. I think it's probably one of the most coal-dominated supply systems, if not in all developed countries. But there is wind is growing. Hydro has been there at that amount in absolute terms for a very long time, and there is really no significant opportunity for any new hydro. Now, most of the rest of the presentation is a series of graphs. This is one of the ones from my newsletter. The main thing to look at is the black line through the middle, because that's the whole of the NEM. And this is demand. It's on a moving annual basis, and it's showing the change, so not the total. And you can see that the change is between about +5 and -10 terawatt hours around the midpoint over that period of now 9 years. And so it went down and it came up a bit, and for the last year and a half, almost 2 years, it's been almost unchanging, which is actually, there's a bit of difference between the states. The yellow line up the top, Western Australia, that's a separate system, which I'm not talking about. Now, next few slides are about how the prices have got out of control for retail consumer prices. That just shows what's happened to average retail prices, and that's in real dollars corrected for inflation. So you can see they've almost doubled in the last, well, however many, that's only just 10 years or less. And that's caused a lot of consternation, but also opened up a lot of opportunities, particularly for embedded generation, for reasons which will become clear in the next couple of slides or so. Now, the next 2 or 3 slides are about one of the 2 main components, I suppose you'd say, of the total cost that make up the price. And this is the network cost, which is separated, as it is most places, into transmission and distribution. And what this graph shows is some data that's produced by quickly, but that follows the same shape as the other one. It starts earlier, and that is one of the main drivers for the higher prices. They were allowed to massively increase the regulated asset base of their businesses, and then they get a sort of guaranteed very nice rate of return on that, so the consumers all have to pay for it. So this is really a big mess, which is of the making of the people running the industry. And it's in the past now, but it's a sort of legacy we've got, and that's another way of looking at it, which shows how the network part went up. Well, that shows the total price and the fact that the wholesale component hardly went up at all. And I've really only put that up there for the very far right-hand bottom corner, which just does show that suddenly wholesale prices actually are beginning to go up. And this is the really big change that's happened in the last year and a half, the last year really, and that's mostly, I think, what we'll be talking about is the wholesale part of it, the generation part of it, for the rest of this webinar. Now this is looking at the history of the wholesale, the spot prices in the market, and if you put aside, there was some particular events that happened in the middle of that period. That goes right back to the beginning of the national electricity market at the end of 1998. And you can see at the far right-hand end of both the graphs, in the last year, the prices everywhere have shot up. And if I redid them now, the dark blue line at the bottom there would actually be more like the others. This is just from a couple of months ago for the last year. Right, now we're now looking at the wholesale market. This also is just by way of a bit of a background. One of the things that's been happening is that the market has become less competitive. There's been more concentration of ownership, and various changes and closure of various power stations and so on is fairly obviously given some market participants an opportunity to sort of game the system, or what you want to use. And this is illustrated by this is the spot prices on the trading. That's the daily maximum price. The maximum price typically only occurred for one 30-minute settlement period, or trading interval, as they're called, but they're caused by the price going up for maybe even shorter period for part of the trading interval. I won't go into the details, but anyway, they just goes up for a very short period and comes back down again. And it's happening repeatedly, particularly in the state of Queensland, or lesser state in South Australia. But the effect of that is that average prices have gone up quite a lot. It's one of the drivers. Now, the next couple of slides are about the closure of old power stations, and a lot of what happened when the national electricity market started. There was a legacy of very significant overcapacity of coal-fired power stations. A whole lot had been built in the preceding 10 years, and we've just now, in the last 2 years, coming to an end of that, and that's one of the really significant changes that sets the context for the shift towards renewable energy. The supply and demand balance is really just becoming tight, and the purpose of this slide is the black was the total capacity when it started, and then if you move out to the right-hand side on the graph, it's moved on 20 years. Most of the capacity is 20 years older, and that means its average age is well over 30 years now. So you can see that over the next 10 years it's going to get very ancient and more decrepit. That's another way of depicting it. I won't stop on that graph. Well, this is really to do with the new generation that's been built. And in terms of nameplate capacity, there's more wind than anything else, but it's actually not so much in terms of the when you multiply by the capacity factor. And now the last few slides are showing the current supply mix and how the supply mix has evolved over the last 10 years. That's for the whole of the national electricity market. It goes up black coal at the bottom, then a brown coal or lignite, which is confined to the state of Victoria and is by far the lowest cost source of fossil fuel generation in the national electricity market. The fuel is extremely cheap, so it's very, very cheap on short-run marginal costs. And of course, the power stations are really all quite old, so it does compete in the market quite competitively. But the significant thing is well, there were 4 big power stations. One of them, a very old one, nearly 50 years old, closed last month, and that has made a significant effect, which doesn't yet show up in this slide. And then the others are gas, hydro, wind and solar, most of which is the rooftop solar. And this is another way of showing it in terms of changes, where you can see the changes more clearly. And you can see the wind and the rooftops and the solar. There is a little bit now of grid scale solar, but most of that is the rooftop solar. And you can see that's where the growth is. Gas generation has gone down in the last few years because wholesale gas prices have gone up very, very significantly. I won't talk more about that, but that is another of the really disruptive things that's been happening in the last year or so. I think the final two slides are about the state of South Australia, where Monica lives. It's only quite a small part of the national electricity market. I'm just trying to think, and it's about 7%, I think, in energy terms, but it's got a much higher penetration. It's very poorly endowed with fossil fuel resources compared with other parts of Australia, so it's always been a bit precarious in terms of traditional generation, and but it has an extremely good wind regime. So it was the first part of Australia where wind generators started being built. It also has very, very good solar resources, and its indigenous fossil fuel is gas, and there was some low quality coal that was closed just under a year ago, and it does depend on supply through the interconnector from Victoria, which it always has done, despite what the critics saying it's full of renewable energy. As you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, in fact, it was heavily dependent on the interconnector when there was almost no wind. And this is just the same data shown in the change form, and that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Okay, so please be reminded to post questions if you have any, and we'll come back to those at the end. The next speaker is Tristan Edis.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay, let's get this showing. All right. Sorry, I have jumped ahead of slides. Okay, so I was asked to talk a little bit about the politics around the Australian electricity sector, but I'll talk about it more broadly. And I think it actually is beautifully summed up the history of the politics surrounding Australia's climate change policy by a book written in 1513 by Niccolo Machiavelli. And I've just put up the little quotes there. I think the key thing is, in trying to drive a new order of things, which is low carbon energy, we have had an awful lot of enemies who have done well under the old conditions, and there haven't been a lot of particularly powerful people defending a change or supporting a change in the order of things. And that is, Niccolo Machiavelli was incredibly wise in that particular little quote, and I'll talk a little bit about how that's manifested itself in Australia. So I want to focus on two policy measures in Australia. They have been an emissions trading scheme, carbon emissions trading scheme, and a renewable energy target, and they've really been the two core focuses of Australian climate change policy. The third one, which I won't go into, relates to energy efficiency. And it's been a very troubled history, hesitating and slow progress with these measures, and I want to talk about the reason for why perhaps that we've had such a troubled history, the political and economic power structures that have driven those outcomes. So back in 1998, it looked pretty straightforward to everyone. We had at the time a Conservative government, so we call our Conservative government the Liberal Party, which will be confusing to American audiences, but it's called the Liberal Party, and it is, but it would generally be thought of as the sort of conservative or the right-wing side of government. And I've just put up a speech there from Alexander Downer, who was the Foreign Minister at 1998. And it is essentially a speech where he is laying out that we will take action that the science around climate change is compelling, and in fact to not make moves even though there was not 100% certainty that there was more than enough scientific evidence supporting the case that there was global warming, that to have done otherwise would have been foolhardy, which I put in bold there. So that is what he said back in 1998. We needed to take action, we were going to take action. And he said in taking action we would, one, observe the Kyoto Protocol, and we would move forward with that was a sensible international agreement that we would follow, and as part of that, front and centre, we would implement an emissions trading scheme, because that made common sense, it made business sense that it would deliver the lowest cost, non-distortionary outcome. It would be relying on the market, and what better way of doing things than to rely on a market, which is where he came from. The philosophical background of the Liberal Party is one where we should rely on markets and not government fiat to drive change. So that was 1998, and we were going to progressively reduce emissions through an emissions trading scheme. If we fast forward to the 2010s, we had a new Liberal Party leader called Tony Abbott, and he said in the 2010s that the plan to introduce an emissions trading scheme by the alternative side of politics, the Labor Party, would be a great big new tax that would radically change the way every Australian lives and every Australian works. It would be a wrecking ball through the economy. It would smash the average household's cost of living, wipe out jobs big time, clean out your wallet, and there's hardly a region in the country that wouldn't have major communities devastated if it went ahead. So that was a big change over that period. So what happened? So I'll also touch on the renewable energy target. So this is some recent comments made by Tony Abbott. He became Prime Minister of the country, and then he was deposed by his own party. So not by an election, but by his own party. And in 2017, in some recent comments, he said, even though he'd managed to reduce the renewable energy target, it was still too high, and it would increase power costs substantially and reduce reliability. It would be the death knell for heavy industries in South Australia, and would almost certainly destroy the aluminium industry everywhere around the country. And that why should the government force Australians to use more expensive and unreliable renewable energy power when we have the world's biggest reserves of coal and natural gas? So that's where we ended up many years later, through an alternative leader. And this is just a snapshot of the political debate that is going on in Australia from the current side of politics that is in government, the Conservatives. So we have there in the right-hand side a picture of, in our Parliament, of the Treasurer holding a lump of coal in his right hand, and revealing that to our Deputy Prime Minister, who has a look of wonder on his face. And they were saying, why are you afraid of coal? Coal is a wonderful thing. And at the same time saying that we have seen a blackout occur in South Australia that was a not just a standard blackout, it was a system black, so we lost all power. And that was being widely blamed on the high penetration of renewable energy in the state of South Australia. And we have also had state Liberal Party oppositions who don't hold government at state government level saying they would scrap renewable energy targets that have been implemented or proposed by Labor state governments. So a pretty toxic environment for renewable energy on one side of politics. Now, how did we get from where we were back in 1998 to where we are now? Looks like a very confusing picture, but I want to talk you through a little bit of the history of our attempts to introduce an emissions trading scheme, which I've referred to as an ETS for short, and also our renewable energy targets. So First of all, we started on the very left-hand side with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. We then had the Howard Liberal Party, the Conservative government, announced that they would introduce a renewable energy target, admittedly a very modest one, but that's what they were going to do. At the same time, this same Howard Liberal Conservative government released a series of discussion papers that were outlining how they were going to move to an emissions trading scheme in 1999. Then in 2000, we introduced our renewable energy target, which was to seek to achieve 9,500 gigawatt hours of additional renewable energy. And so that was sort of the pathway. It looked like the government was making attempts to do something to reduce our emissions. Then in 2002, we had the Foreign Minister and the Environment Minister announce the Federal Climate Change Forward Strategy, is what they called it at the time. And it wasn't, admittedly, during this whole period of 1997 to 2002, while the government was implementing measures, they were very weak measures to reduce emissions, it would have to be said. But they were nonetheless doing things. And then we saw the first state introduce their own emissions trading scheme in 2003. Then in 2003 at the same time, and Monica Oliphant was actually involved in this review, the Tambling Review, made a recommendation. This was a federal government independent body, advised the government to increase the renewable energy target to 20,000 gigawatt hours by 2020. And then we saw basically a about face from the government. The Howard government rejected explicitly the introduction of an emissions trading scheme. So the bureaucracy were furiously working as part of the Climate Change Forward Strategy on a proposal for an emissions trading scheme to be introduced on a national level. And before it was debated within Cabinet, John Howard, who was our Prime Minister, rejected it and said, no, I will not introduce an emissions trading scheme. And we did not even get to see a debate within Cabinet on that, even though the bureaucracy had come to a agreed position that we should introduce an emissions trading scheme. And that was in 2003. In 2004, we released an energy white paper, and that basically essentially said, we're not too worried about climate change. We don't think Australia needs to move on this. Renewable energy is not the answer. And if we're going to do anything, we need to focus on CCS, or carbon capture and storage, or clean coal. What that is, the answer is, until we've cleaned up coal, really there's no viable solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from electricity supply. So it was essentially the federal government said, we don't need to do anything more except work on clean coal. But then the states started doing things, and so they progressed an emissions trading process. They said, if the federal government will not introduce an emissions trading scheme, we will work towards doing that. At the same time, the Victorian government announced, which is a state government, that they would introduce their own renewable energy target in 2006. Then later in 2006, the New South Wales government said they would introduce a renewable energy target. And then in 2007, the Queensland government said they would do it. So things started moving in spite of the federal government's resistance. Then the federal Liberal Party in mid-2007 said, actually, you know what, maybe we were wrong, and look, we'll introduce an emissions trading scheme. And then they also said in that same year, actually, we'll increase the renewable energy target to 30,000 gigawatt hours in exchange for the states not doing anything or dropping their own targets. But it was all too late. Climate change was now an important political issue, and Labor won the federal election in the year 2007 with the policy of introducing an emissions trading scheme and expanding the renewable energy target to 45,000 gigawatt hours. Now, they then failed in being able to introduce their emissions trading scheme in 2009. In 2010, we saw some changes to the renewable energy target. In 2010, it all became too hard for the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and he dumped the proposal for an emissions trading scheme in 2010. He was then deposed as leader. Gillard then was elected, and in 2011 she actually had to form a coalition government with a series of independents and the Greens Party, and agreed to introduce an emissions trading scheme in 2011. It began in 2012, but then she lost the election in 2013, and that emissions trading scheme was abolished. We then, at the same time, the new Tony Abbott-led Conservative government wanted to review the renewable energy target. That then was cut quite substantially. But then in 2016, the Federal Labor Party, which was still in opposition and remains in opposition, said they would expand the target to 50% renewable energy. And we now have a Victorian government saying they're going to introduce a renewable energy target. So it's almost like back to the future. Now, I want to sort of map how this all unveiled. Was essentially, we started off with lip service tokenism over the period of 97 to 2002, then an outright rejection of a need to do anything, the Howard rejection. States then went to the rescue in that period between 2005 and 2007, followed by what I called a brief, maybe a mirage or victory, when the Rudd government was elected, but then fossil fuel essentially fought back. Then renewables kind of emerged with their own muscles, and we're starting to see a new phase come through. Now, why has it been so hard? Well, what we've essentially got here is this is a map of Australia's exports by overall share of value of total exports. And what we can see here is ores, slag and ash, which is essentially coal and iron ore, and over here mineral fuels. This is essentially natural gas and oil, absolutely dominate our merchandise exports. We are the largest coal exporter in the world, or have been, and we will soon be the largest liquefied natural gas exporter, and we also export energy intensive metals. That is what dominates our exports. And I think our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister, summed it up. He said he thought the biggest problem with the carbon tax was it said to the wider world that somehow coal should be left in the ground and not sold. Well, really, truly, I cannot think of more damaging things to our future. And that sort of sums up a large part of our political economy, is that they see coal as integral to our economy's success, and that has been very, very influential. Essentially, the RET and carbon pricing have faced very powerful enemies, and that has been, basically our economy has been driven by a large boom in construction, in mining and LNG, and at the same time we've had a very weak manufacturing sector, which is largely dominated by energy intensive industry, not knowledge intensive industries. It's not like a German manufacturing, it's more very simple primary metals. That's what's dominated our manufacturing sector, and our supporters have been weak to non-existent. We import solar modules and wind turbines, and electronic control equipment are all imported, and renewable energy is essentially a threat to our major export industries. And this imbalance in business power has also been mirrored in the government bureaucracy's views. So it's essentially a quarry vision. Australia is a quarry to the rest of the world. That is where our lot in life lies. Now, just in the last 2 years, we've seen our mining boom, construction boom crash. Oil prices have crashed, and that has made LNG not very profitable. And at the same time, though, unfortunately, while we're not making very much money out of LNG, that sucked up all of our domestic gas supplies, and we're now facing a gas shortage domestically and a spike in Australian gas prices. At the same time, no one will invest in new coal power stations, and they're shutting down the existing ones, and that has seen a skyrocketing in electricity prices in Australia. So the light blue is carbon prices when we had the carbon price in place in 2013, and this is our forward contract prices for electricity in the dark grey. And you can see they are double what they were when the carbon price was in place, and this has been driven. So the carbon price has been abolished, yet our electricity prices are double what they were when the carbon price was in place, because coal is closing and gas is incredibly expensive. And what we're now seeing is perhaps an opening or a splintering in this quarry vision, where now wind and solar represent our cheapest options for new power supply. Solar power is very common in Australian households. It represents something like a fifth of households in South Australia and Queensland use solar power, and it is increasingly attractive to businesses. And so now we are seeing perhaps the emergence of a new power structure and a new set of incentives. And I just want to leave it there for my presentation because I'm already over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for a very thoughtful and interesting presentation. Our last speaker is Andrew Stock.
Good afternoon or good morning. I'll just get this up and we should be right. Okay. So what I've been asked to address is what's the situation in South Australia. And as Monica indicated in her introduction, South Australia has one of the highest penetrations of new renewable energy in the world. It's a leadership position that's developed in little more than a decade. The state had no conventional hydro resources or biomass power potential, and before the transition took place over the last decade, the state has been totally reliant on fossil fueled power sourced from within the state from natural gas and brown coal, and from power from interstate with a relatively small interconnection, and that power is brown coal sourced. But the state did have world-class wind and solar resources, but these were totally untapped. It suffered from high consumer power prices driven by a number of factors: lack of competition in the regional wholesale power market, a reliance on gas, and high-cost, poor-quality coal resources. So how was this transition achieved, and what have been some of the impacts? The graphs here show just how dramatic the growth in large-scale wind and household solar uptake have been since 2000. In little more than a decade, the percentage of renewable energy in the state's power supply has grown from 0 to over 50%. And that makes it one of the highest percentages of new renewables in any jurisdiction globally. This graph, drawn from a recent report by the IEA, shows different phases of variable renewable energy generation, and you can see that South Australia sits right at the top of the graph along with Denmark. Justin has reviewed the progress of the Renewable Energy Target Scheme. I think the important point to mention here is that this scheme was the driving force behind renewable electricity investment in South Australia. The scheme, as Tristan pointed out, has gone through some ups and downs. As part of the review in 2014 by the Conservative government, a review chaired by an avowed climate skeptic, after which the target was reduced to 33,000 gigawatt hours by 2020. What that review did was force effectively the policy uncertainty, forced a collapse in large-scale wind investment, which this curve shows. You can see the blue in the graph is wind investment, and that fell to 0 in the 2014 year. Indeed, it was only reverse auctions by a small territory, the Australian Capital Territory, which resulted in any further investment in 2015. So we've effectively had 2 years of no investment in wind, but what was happening is that solar PV investment was continuing through that, and that was because the federal scheme was split into not only a large-scale scheme but a small-scale scheme supporting solar, and the net impact of that was to reduce the upfront installation cost of PV and provide a revenue benefit to households through the feed-in tariffs. So on the one hand, consumers, as Hugh pointed out, were facing high retail power prices due to network increases, and so consumers raced to install solar PV. Today, over 1.6 million houses in Australia have PV installed on them. Now, other states could have benefited from the renewable target, in particular New South Wales and Victoria, also well endowed with excellent wind resources. But in the late 2000s, Conservative governments in those states implemented anti-wind development regulations around in particular siting wind turbines, and they severely limited opportunities for large-scale wind projects. On the other hand, South Australia had a stable, progressive government that facilitated planning regulations to encourage development, and the relatively sparsely populated state had major generation plant several hundred kilometres away in the north of the what's called Spencer Gulf, the larger of the two gulfs there in the map, had some significant generation plant there, and the transmission lines traversed, as it happened, very good wind resources in the mid-north of the state, which are highlighted with the cloud, I guess you'd call it. Similarly, the interconnector that runs down to Victoria and connecting lines in South Australia also pass through an area which has very good wind resources. And the convergence of these two factors saw a major expansion in new wind power projects, where today around 1,600 megawatts of wind has been built. An investment of well over $3 billion. And in terms of solar PV, 1 in 4 households have installed solar PV. And this means that together South Australians have one of the highest per capita, in fact the second highest globally, per capita penetration of new renewables. The rise in household electricity prices, the substantial falls in the cost of PV driven by upscaling by Chinese manufacturers in particular, together with feed-in tariffs at the time, great solar radiation, combined to make South Australia a very attractive place. And the installation of PV on rooftops, where 1 in 4 houses has solar PV installed, is very noticeable if you ever fly into Adelaide. This is just an example of taken from Google, but what I've highlighted in that slide are those houses or residences with solar PV installed, and you can see, as it happens in that graph, it's much higher than 25%. That 25% is an average across the state. What's also quite interesting is typically PV is installed on houses where people are not particularly well off financially because they've been shocked by power prices. So these high levels of wind and solar began to impact on competitors in the state and consumers. They contribute a significant part of the state's power supplies, and at times of high renewable supply, what was happening was that the gas and coal plants couldn't compete on cost, and so they lost market share to renewables, reducing the volumes generated over which they could amortise their fixed costs. When renewables were competing, they were driving down the wholesale cost of fossil fuel plants substantially. The prices that they could achieve in the market. The 760 megawatts of coal stations had high cost structures and poor quality coal and were unable to compete economically, and the owners decided to close them in May 2016. At times of strong wind and sun, South Australia has become a net exporter of power. In fact, in the last 24 hours, I think we had strong winds and that was taking place. With the whole pretty well the whole in-state demand at times being met by renewables. But the increase in reliance on renewables, high-priced gas and interconnection, having seen coal close, left the state exposed to the market power of gas generators during interconnector outages or times of low output of renewables. What that meant was that the thermal plants, when they were in a position to exert pricing power, did so ruthlessly. In Australia, the maximum wholesale price for power is set at $14,000 a megawatt hour or thereabouts. So when renewables competition is high, when renewables output is low, power producers, particularly gas producers, adopted pricing strategies to maximise economic rent. For example, in July 16, as this graph shows, we see that contrasted with a year earlier where we had coal production, significant input through an interconnector, the interconnectors with Victoria. In 2016, the interconnector was taken out for maintenance and expansion. The coal plant was down, and so the relative market power of gas producers had increased substantially. When wind is blowing, that's not a problem, but there are some days when we can have good sunshine and little wind in winter, and that's what happened in early July 2016. Opponents of renewables, just on that point, what we have seen at times like that is prices be highly volatile and bid up in each half-hour period, and it's remarkable how the bidding moves, albeit not breaching the current rules of the market, carefully not doing that, but certainly a lot of volatility in pricing at times when the interconnector may be out of service and wind production is low. These high power prices in the state, not surprisingly, saw the opponents of renewables become very vocal in the media. For example, we had a national daily circulated around Australia, had headlines on the front page like this: wind turbines suck more power than they generate. In September, we had a severe weather front hit the state with destructive winds being forecast by the national forecaster. The market operator reviewed the risks and decided that they weren't out of the ordinary. They chose to operate the system without taking conservative precautions, heavily loading imports through the interconnector and backing down gas plants within the state. Wind turbines were producing at high rates. But the storm front generated a number of tornadoes with winds up to 260 kilometres an hour that knocked down 20 high voltage transmission towers, and those towers are on the major transmission spine to which a number of the wind power projects in the mid-north were connected. There were 6 to 8 surges in voltage within a matter of minutes, and that caused a number of wind turbine protection systems to trip the turbines out, causing interconnected demand to rise rapidly within a matter of milliseconds. The thermal plant operating at the time was unable to respond in time, and neither did load shedding systems. So what happened was that there was a frequency collapse that caused the interconnector to disconnect, and the state went black. Before the storm had even passed and the system had been restarted, we had politicians and media commentators with no industry knowledge blaming wind turbines. And even though there have been now, I think, 4 investigative reports which have largely cleared wind farms, the prevailing view in the media still sees wind turbines as the culprit. We've had a number of other events in the state, transmission maintenance outages interstate in Victoria, which were poorly coordinated by their owners and the market operator, saw South Australia island in December. It didn't see supply disruptions, but the state was islanded. but a major aluminium smelter in Victoria lost power for over 5 hours. Though it was nothing to do with wind, the conservative media again blamed renewables. In February 2017, on the 8th of February, the market operator failed to use forecasts from the National Weather Bureau of heatwave maximum temperatures. That meant it under-forecast not only the maximum temperature but the impact on electricity demand for air conditioning by several hundred megawatts. Standby gas plant was unable to start in time, and over 100,000 customers were load shed on a 41 degrees centigrade day. Notwithstanding inaccurate forecasting, media and the conservative commentators again blamed renewables. And yet 2 days later, the same heat wave hit Sydney. The market operator was out days in advance managing down the load, talking down the load by encouraging consumers to reduce their power usage. A major aluminium smelter in that state had 2 pot lines turned off for a period of an hour each, and almost 3,000 megawatts of thermal plant, that's coal plant and gas plant, either failed to start, tripped out or underperformed, and there was not a word of criticism in the media of thermal plant failures. In early March in South Australia, over 600 megawatts of thermal plant, including some units in this gas-fired station, tripped instantly as a result of an electromechanical failure. The wind turbines in the state rode through the resultant voltage surges without a hiccup, but the interconnector overloaded and it very nearly tripped it again. In fact, it overloaded almost to the same degree that it did back in September last year. So again, the state government copped the blame. There was very little in the media about the fact that 600 megawatts of thermal plant had tripped out, that South Australia had almost gone black again. No comment about that, notwithstanding it was almost the same magnitude of impact as the previous September. However, what had been happening was that the state government had been receiving no end of criticism for over a year over the state's power security and prices. And in Australia, the state government does not, this state government does not only have the assets, it doesn't control the regulations, and it doesn't administer and manage and operate the system. So it has since announced, taken action and announced what it's calling a power plan to take a number of measures to improve supply security, including a 100 megawatt hour grid scale battery storage system to provide fast start frequency support and synthetic inertia, a 250 megawatt fast start gas-fired power station, which will likely comprise several aeroderivative machines coupled to generators which can also spin as synchronous condensers, providing insurance power supplies and added inertia to the system, 2 procurement contracts for state electricity supplies for the government's own use that will add generating capacity and renewable dispatchable plant, as well as taking a range of other steps, one of which being to ensure that the state can intervene in advance of extreme conditions through emergency regulations rather than respond after those events have created impact. I guess it's fair to say that the world will be watching just to see how successful these measures turn out to be. But nevertheless, the state continues to expand solar PV, solar thermal and wind output. And in fact, in recent days, there have been some significant announcements around large-scale solar PV plants going ahead of several hundred megawatts. Finally, in closing, if you want to find out more about these things, the Climate Council publishes a number of reports, not just on climate change and its impacts, which are very well regarded, but also solutions around renewables, storage, and the impact that gas is having, including a most recent report released just last week called Pollution and Price, the Cost of Investing in Gas, and one that was published last September in relation to the events then called the Perfect Storm, July last year analysing the role of gas in South Australia's power prices. And with that, I'll finish up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. An excellent presentation on the situation in South Australia. I learned quite a bit myself, and yeah, I think you're sort of perhaps missing a career in journalism. Okay, so we will go through some of the questions that have been sent in throughout all three speakers. The first question is for Tristan Edis. Australian fossil fuel-based generation of electrons have been ignoring the main waste product, heat, about a quarter of the primary energy, about 3/4 of the primary energy, I should say. Globally, we have over 5,000 thermal energy distribution grids, also a few in Australia. Can we expect utilisation of this hidden asset anytime soon?
Unlikely, although it might pick up a little bit, but with high gas prices, it might alter some economics. In some respects, in favour of using waste heat, but also against it. So you won't see new cogeneration plant built because gas prices are so high. You're likely to see, so for example, if you're trying to use heat for in households or heat in commercial purposes, you're probably more likely to see people relying on electricity-based reverse cycle air conditioning, I would have thought, and so I don't see any kind of meaningful, significant pickup in use of waste heat in the Australian context.
Yep. Okay. I think also our somewhat more decentralised settlements arrangements here make it more difficult to do district heating than might be the case in Europe too.
Well, could I just add something on that? This is actually a case study. A few years back, the City of Sydney, this is a council for the inner part of the City of Sydney, Australia's largest city, had a very ambitious plan, did a lot of detailed investigations for having localised distributed generation with using gas and with reticulated heat energy, and it found really that it turned out not with the cost of the PV coming down so much and looking more seriously at energy efficiency, it found that was a lower route to reducing the emissions of the whole of the area of the City of Sydney Council than the gas and distributed waste, distributed heat option, which just confirms what Tristan was saying.
Okay, and so yeah, next question is for you, Hugh. Australia can stay an energy powerhouse in the Asia-Pacific region. What is your view on eliminating the heavy distribution losses? Energy distribution with a nationwide regional interconnector HVDC grid. Keen investors would like that enabled to repower the APAC region. So, okay, beyond Australia into the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah, well, people are certainly talking about it. Some people in Australia, I think some people in countries, more notably, I believe in China, and I suspect other countries. I think that Australia certainly has a lot of opportunities in the longer term to do that. It's sort of, feel like it's a sort of kind of like the Sahara of the Eastern Hemisphere, as it were. So there's quite a lot of parallels with the all the sort of what's being talked about for Europe and North Africa, though of course the distances are much further between the centre of Australia and China and Japan and so on. But yeah, there is, I think in the long term, there's a, and it is being discussed.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. The next question is for Tristan. What was the price of CO2 emissions during the period of the emissions trading scheme?
$23 was the fixed price at the commencement of the scheme, and it went up slightly. I think it finished, so it went up to $24 something in the year after, and then a little bit above $25 the year after, before it was abolished.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was the way that the whole scheme was designed was to have an introductory period of not actually being a trading scheme where the market set the price, but to be a fixed price scheme. In other words, a bit more like a carbon tax, to just get all the systems bedded down. And it was terminated just at the point where it would have, if it had kept going, would have transitioned to a real trading scheme.
Okay. Okay, there's a question here. I might throw this one to Andrew Stock. Do you expect a large uptake of domestic storage in South Australia, and how will the state absorb this if so?
Look, I think it's quite interesting to see what will happen with storage at the domestic household level. There's a lot of interest being shown, and but I think it's still early days. Why I think it will be very likely that storage will play a big role going forward is that, firstly, the high level of penetration of solar PV on rooftops, 25%. Secondly, that there's an arbitrage effectively available, a price arbitrage between now buying power off the grid and at something like 35 cents a kilowatt hour, and exporting net to the grid from one's solar panels, which is around possibly 4 to 5 cents, although there is no minimum price now regulated in South Australia. It could be as low as 0. So there's a significant price arbitrage that's available, and there's every prospect, I think, that battery prices will come down at the same rate that, or around the same sort of rate we saw with PV. Dramatic price falls, and already a number of analysts are saying that in South Australia today, at the sort of commercial prices being offered by some of the battery manufacturers and marketers, that they are economic to install. I think one of the other things that's points worth making is that as we saw with PV, it wasn't necessarily simple economics that drove decisions. Once consumer products get down to the sort of price point of a few $1,000s, people that want to minimise their exposure to price volatility associated with future electricity bills and reduce their bill size, but also the volatility and risk that that bill will go up, will make decisions that perhaps engineers or economists may not make, because what they want to do is provide, they're buying insurance and insulating themselves against that future risk. So I guess a long way of saying that I think it'll be a very interesting space to watch. There are already a number of experiments going on in the state with some of the larger electricity retailers to see whether they can create virtual power plants by coordinating storage across many households, and I think this is a whole area that will expand dramatically. There potentially are a few roadblocks in the way. The currently peer-to-peer trading of electricity isn't allowed for under the National Electricity Market. So one household can't sell a surplus to another. But there's a lot of pressure building for peer-to-peer platforms and those that are developing those to see them rolled out as well. And I think if that were to be allowed, we would see yet another incentive for people to install storage. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Just forgive me for a second. I'm just skimming one of the questions here.
Might just add to Andrew's answer. So the sales data for solar PV systems, we were seeing a steady decline in solar PV capacity installations and number of systems installed over the last 2 years. And then just in the since November, we have seen a very incredible uptick. It's like this huge reversal back in increase in solar PV sales. And last week was our largest recorded sales of solar PV for, we saw a boom in 2011 and 2012 and then a sort of steady drop off in sales, and basically as government incentives dropped away. But still a very strong underlying market, but in decline. But then it just it's just gone through the roof in the last few months. And trying to work out what are the reasons for that. Well, one is module prices have dropped, but they're not as big as they should be as a reason. And that's countered to some extent by a drop-off in the size of the government rebate or subsidy for solar PV that occurred in the move to the new year, into 2017. And one of the views or theories is that the excitement around batteries is not necessarily leading to installation of batteries at the present moment, but is driving increased inquiries and interest in installing solar systems, which is an indicator of latent demand for batteries that will then come forward once those batteries reach that sort of a critical tipping point that Andrew spoke about around, a certain thousands of dollar threshold where a household goes, oh, well, that's enough, that's low enough for me to slap it on my credit card. And we haven't got there yet for batteries, but that increase in sales of solar systems that we've seen is partly driven by an increase in electricity prices, but there's something else going on there which we think is linked to excitement and interest around batteries.
Okay, thank you, Tristan. There's a question here which I'll put to all the panellists. Andrew Stock's presentation did not mention the contracted black start generators that failed to restart the SA grid within the contracted times on the 28th of September. It was left to the SA grid to be black started 4 hours later via the Victorian interconnector. Why did the black start contractors get off scot-free when they are being paid continuously as an insurance policy?
Well, perhaps I could comment firstly, Ben. Yes, the questioner is right, and I guess in the time available, there's a lot more I could have said about the circumstances in South Australia and why it is that, notwithstanding all of the inquiries that have gone on in relation to the blackout, very little has been written or talked about in relation to the failure of the fossil fuel generators that were contracted to provide those black start services to actually work for various reasons, and I don't think time permits to go into that. But it's, in a way, it's symptomatic of the situation we have here. I mean, I think it's very interesting, for example, that on the circumstances in early March where, in fact, the event that occurred when the 600 megawatts of thermal plant tripped received very little media, notwithstanding how perilously close the state came at the time to a system black again, with the interconnector load well and truly running past its limits. It's remarkable also that there was very little commentary about the 3,000 megawatts of thermal plant in New South Wales, gas that couldn't start, coal that couldn't run. Notwithstanding, I guess there's just a dramatic contrast between the way in which the media particularly deal with events which they attribute to renewables that in many cases are not, and events related to fossil fuel plants. I think one of the reasons that that's occurring is that we have not only the media being conservative and perhaps having agendas, but we also have a regulatory and rule-making structure that hasn't changed much in in over 2 decades since the national electricity market has been running. For example, in one of the charts I showed, there was a lot of volatility in pricing related to the way that gas generators bid, and that's now reflected in the sorts of pricing charts that Hugh showed, but in his graphs as well, increasing power prices. But we've seen very little attention to the market power questions. Why is it that the rules allow effectively capacity withdrawal only to be rebid 5 minutes later once a minimum price has been achieved of at least $2,000 for the whole half hour? and why is it that 5-minute bidding and half-hour settlements, which is an issue that has been there for consideration since 1999, has still not yet been addressed. And that issue in particular is discriminatory against fast start or fast response technologies such as batteries provide. So I think it's all part of a series of things that touch on the sort of words I think that Tristan started his talk with around Machiavelli. If one goes back to that, you can view through that prism. I think it helps explain quite a lot of things that are going on.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, there's a question for Tristan. How can the community be engaged in pushing and easing transition to renewable energy, considering one major factor of resistance, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is the risk of loss of jobs for coal workers?
I think the Labor Party has had to grapple with this firsthand here in Australia, because they the unions are very powerful within the Labor Party, but their representation of the workforce as a whole is declining and is quite small. But within mining, particularly coal mining and coal-fired power stations, unionisation is very high. And the Labor Party has had to grapple with tensions within their own membership, where they have sections of their membership that are very environmentally minded and environmentally concerned, and other sections of their membership that are very concerned about union membership. And unions represent a large amount of the votes on the executive, and also a large amount of the funding to the Labor Party. And so they've internally had to resolve these conflicts. And I think they have come to some degree of landing that they need to come up with some kind of plan and a series of policies that are going to soften the blow to workers in coal-fired power stations. And I think we saw the first iteration of that with the closure of the Hazelwood power station, where there was an attempt to negotiate a sort of job swap situation, where some workers that were closer towards retirement in power stations that weren't getting closed would agree to take redundancies, while the younger workers in the Hazelwood power station would be given jobs in the still operating coal-fired power stations. So that's one example. Obviously that only goes so far, and eventually you've got to close all the coal-fired power stations over time. But that is one example where they're trying to actively manage this this issue of trying to soften the blow of a section of the community that will be particularly hard hit through no real fault of their own through this transition away from coal and towards renewables and low carbon electricity. So that would be one thing I would offer.
Can I make add additional observations? It's a bit of facts. There is actually rather confusion and discussion about this, because most people don't understand that of all the coal that's mined in Australia, some considerably less than 20% of it is burned in Australia. By far the great majority is exported. So where the jobs will actually be lost is more in the power stations than in the coal mining. And a further sort of refinement in Victoria, where it's brown coal, that can't be exported. The power stations and the mines are fully integrated, so there's no distinction between the people working in the power station and in the mine. I think very few people, because highly mechanised, so not many people work in the mines. But in New South Wales and Queensland, which are the big black coal states, that's where it's in fact only, I think, about 10% of the coal that's mined in those two states actually gets burnt in Australian power stations. There is a considerable loss of jobs in the Queensland export coal mining industry, but that's got nothing to do with Australia's transition to renewables. It's got a lot to do with the fact that well, reduction of demand for Australian coal in the markets, and that's probably oil science going to continue also, at least in terms of thermal coal, and it's quite unrelated to what Australia is doing.
Ben, can I just make one other comment, if I may, in relation to perhaps the counter to the downside associated with closing coal? I think the questioner may have been from Africa.
Yes.
One of the things that the Climate Council did was a study looking at the opportunities for job creation that came with meeting a 50% renewable target in Australia, which is a policy of some states and Federal Labor Party. That policy would create net 28,000 new jobs within the country. In probably the state that is most affected by closing coal power stations, which is Victoria, that state, although it might have lost something like 5,000 jobs with closing coal, would still create another, I think it was 10 to 12,000 jobs associated with growing its renewables industry. So the state was still better off, and people, provided they were able to be retrained in an adequate way, and were able to relocate in some cases, would be better off. There are still impacts, and so one of the other aspects that's very important here is to be able to plan this in an organised way over time, so that these adjustments can be done in ways that communities directly affected can manage migration plans or relocation and retraining plans. But the opportunities associated with employment for greater renewables uptake far exceed the jobs that would be lost through closing some coal-fired power stations.
Okay, thank you. Joanna, how much time do we have left for questions?
We still have a few minutes.
Okay, well, I'll do one and maybe two more, and we'll see how we go. So also to you, Andrew, follow-up question on peer-to-peer trading. Is it possible for customers of the same retailer with the retailer's cooperation, or is it simply prohibited under the NEM?
Well, my understanding currently is that it's not able to be given effect through the current rules of the NEM. Tristan may have a more detailed view on that.
Yep.
No, I couldn't add anything further to it. I mean, I think some people don't take into account the fact that you've still got to pay the network owner in all this, and it doesn't really matter that you might be supplying to your neighbour. The electricity network isn't going to give you a particularly favourable hearing, and so people kind of look at it and think, oh well, you know, I'm selling my electricity to the grid for 5 cents and my next door neighbour's paying 32. Why can't we do a deal between me and my neighbour? And sometimes they forget that in between those two, unless they want to run a extension line across the fence, the network's going to sit there in the middle, creating some difficulties for them. There is some work going on through Power Shop, which is a small Australian retailer, where they are trying to create some kind of platform for people to direct their where they choose to sell their solar electricity, so giving them outlets for or a market for buying that solar electricity. But it's in early days, and I don't know whether that's necessarily going to generate a premium for those people selling their solar electricity.
Okay, I think that's probably it. I think there's no other questions that we can handle in this stage, so we'll just pass back to Joanna to conclude the webinar.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelist speakers for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. It was an excellent session, and we had great presentations and truly dynamic and interactive Q&A session, which I hope you all appreciated. To contact the panelist speakers for further information, please see their own contact information in their presentations, which are all linked on the ISES website. So I'll leave the presentations up there and linked for another 24 hours, and then ISES members, you guys can log in and you'll have the downloadable presentations in the members area. I would especially like to thank our moderator, Ben Elliston, for doing a wonderful job on moderating the presentations and the Q&A. And a special thank you to Monica Oliphant, who put this webinar together and who organized it all. So thank you so much to the both of you as well. The next ISES webinar will take place in May and will focus on solar resource assessment. So more details will be posted about this webinar on our website in the coming days. We welcome you all to register for that one as well. You may view today's webinar recording in a couple of hours on our website and also on the YouTube channel. And as mentioned before, ISES members, you guys log into our website or the membership page. You should all know where the login details are, and then you can see the webinar recording and the presentations. If you have comments or feedback, we welcome you to share this with us so that we can continue to improve our webinar series for you. Please participate in the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar once we close it and sent via follow-up email, or send your feedback to public.relations@ises.org. That's all we have time for today. Thank you once again to our expert panelist speakers, Andrew Scott, Hugh Sadler, and Tristan Edis, our moderators, Ben Elliston and Monica Oliphant. Wish you all a great start to your day, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is in your part of the world, and see you in our next webinar.